And can everyone see my VS Code right now?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I can't always see the Zoom grid. I appreciate the thumbs up. So we've done a lot of good work here, right? Whether I use this requests library to send a put request, or I use Thunder client, we now have this put endpoint. And just to kind of do like a high level, I think, review of what we did. We use this existing route that we already have. We want this one, right? We've got API/v1/Pokemon slash that would be the noun project. Apologies there. API/v1/Pokemon that goes to /ID, right? Which can accept an integer or a string from our sort of custom converter logic that we wrote for that. That's living in our converters file. And then from here, we go to our API view that handles a single Pokemon. Right, and let me go ahead and close these out so we can take a look at that one. Just to very quickly recap. And we're using Django REST Framework's very powerful API view. And what we're doing now is, before we just had written a get method. And Django REST Framework gives us a method for each different HTTP verb: get, post, put, create. And what you'll do in a bit is write a method named post, def post, that looks a lot like this for creating a brand new Pokemon, and def delete for deleting a Pokemon. Put is for updating an existing Pokemon. And we look at the ID that comes in, that we grab through how we defined our URLs PY. Depending on if that is an integer or string, and I'll just close this stuff out, I think. We grab our Pokemon because we have to query the database in a different way, depending on if we have an ID or a name. Once we have the Pokemon, we use our serializer, which does all the work of looking at request.data, which has the body of the HTTP request, which is a bunch of JSON. And Pokemon Serializer hooks into our Django models and does all the really nice work of creating a new Pokemon instance, right? That it kind of wraps in serialized Pokemon. And through these serializer methods, we're basically hooking into the validation methods that we've seen, like full clean and so on, because this is such a common use case. So we can call isValid to do our validation logic. And we saw that when I passed in a bad name that didn't start with a capital letter, it indeed failed this validation check. So isValid really is hooking into Django's full clean and running all our model validations. And then this will save that Pokemon model instance to the database. And then we send back this 204 success response that also tells the client, we succeeded, you don't need any content. If there was an error, we do want to send back a 400 response so the client know what happened. And if we want to build this out, we could maybe, send some information about the error message back. And before kind of diving into writing some of the front end code, I just want to see if folks have any kind of questions about this. Cool. So now we've been doing a lot of back-end work. Our job is to do a little front-end work. And probably here in Pokemon item, what we're going to want to do in this Pokemon item class, and just as a refresher, and let me get Slack off of this screen share screen. And let me close out all these ones that we don't want. And go to the one that we do, which is, I'll just open it up again. And I'll open up the network tab because it's always good to have the network tab and the network tab and or the console open so I can see if there's any errors. And we have our Pokemon app, right? And we could, the components, React DevTools has all this crazy nesting because of React Router. But we can see our network requests that our Pokemon app makes. I click on Pokemon. We're getting Pokemon information. Oh, excuse me. We're making a query to look at the rock as well. We get our little icon here from the nouns database. Not sure why it's not showing up in headers here in DevTools. And but now we want to add like some form fields here to update our Pokemon. And just as a very quick recap of the structure of this, I'll use components actually. So we have the router, which has all of this stuff nested in it. And you can see there's all this crazy stuff that happens. But if we kind of collapse things out a bit, we have our app components. We have a nav bar. And we use an outlet, right, to render whatever particular Pokemon component that we want. And so if we just take a quick look at maybe a router file, just to remind ourselves of the structure of our front-end application here, right? So we're going to be working on the Pokemon page and with the Pokemon item component. And I think I'll leave that up there so we can get good feedback and put this off to the side. And a couple things need to happen here. One, I want to create the UI stuff and not worry about React component state, Ajax, or Axios, etc. Right? So I want some form fields. I probably want some form fields for, let's just deal with maybe the Pokemon type and description, and maybe if it was captured or not. And captured, let's make captured a checkbox, just for fun. Two, write some sort of handler function to grab data from those fields when user clicks a button, basically, right? We're going to need a button that the user clicks on, and we're going to need to grab the data from those fields, send that data to put, API /v1 /Pokemon /ID with data in request body, format data correctly, do whatever React component state use effect stuff we need to make React work nice, which is a huge placeholder, but I just want to kind of get the ball rolling and like map out our steps. So I'm going to start off by, I'm just going to write the basic fields that I want to add here to this kind of Pokemon item class. And I'm not going to worry too much about this other stuff. I think I'm just going to put this all below it. I might need to do a little work on when we want to show the form or not, but I'll come back to that later. In fact, what I might even do is maybe to make life simpler, let me just write a different components. And I'm just going to call it Pokemon form just to get started. We're going to pass in a Pokemon. And it's going to look pretty much the same as everything else. And we're going to use it inside this Pokemon item. And now I don't have to think about Pokemon item at all for the moment. And we can just build out what we need and what we want in here. So let's use an HTML form and let's start with that. And let's add an input field. Of type text. We'll add a placeholder, and this is where we can show existing data. So let's do Pokemon.name. Let's assume that we're always going to get Pokemon passed in as a prop here, which I think will make life easier. And we're not going to worry about like the on change or any of that stuff yet, because I just want to get my basic inputs rolling and see some stuff show up on the screen. And I'm going to copy and paste this, and we're going to do this again for a description of the Pokemon. So instead of Pokemon name here, we're going to do Pokemon dot description for the placeholder. And we probably need a couple other things here. Let's see if we can't maybe do like a checkbox. If a Pokemon is caught or captured. And I actually am going to check my model real quick to make sure that I am working off of good data of what I have here. So we've got name, levels, and captured is indeed a Boolean that's set to false by default. So that's indeed going to be great for a checkbox. So let's use a label, and inside the label, let's add another input field. I'll put the closing thing there, but this one is going to be of type checkbox. We'll give it an ID of caught. I might need to give the other ones IDs, but we'll come back to that. And it's going to have a property, right? Inputs have this, input fields in HTML have this attribute checked. And basically that is a Boolean that will determine if we see a little check mark in there or not. And we want this to be Pokemon.captured, I believe. And, you know, these red squigglies are just because VS Code doesn't know what kind of Pokemon object this is. That's a bit more of a complex thing. There are ways to give hints, but we're not going to worry about that. And I'm just going to add a little message here to go along with our label. And this is a good amount of code. I do want to add a button, but I want to just get this to render to make sure I haven't made any mistakes. You know, later on, I'll probably move this into its own file if I want. But for now, it's kind of nice to do it this way. And now here in our Pokemon item class, maybe just below, or maybe even inside this list item stuff, maybe we just, let's see how it looks if we add it all in here like this. And we do Pokemon form, Pokemon equals Pokemon. Because we're already getting Pokemon passed in as a prop to Pokemon item. So I'm actually, this is a pretty good start. I'm actually seeing some stuff here. This checkbox is fixed at false because we haven't hooked it up and made it kind of what's called a controlled component, where it's not like the browser and the DOM that kind of hold this information that we type in, but React. But this looks pretty good. I don't know if I want that dot there in the unordered list. So maybe let's, well, just for the moment, like we've got all this stuff wrapped inside a list item. Li, let's see, ul. Maybe what I'll just do is I'll just put it inside there like that. And that looks pretty good, right? That's a pretty good start. I think all we really need now is a button, and then we're off to the races. So let's go ahead and add ourselves a button. Excuse me. And what we are going to do here is make an HTML button element. I am going to write an on-click method, and it's just going to I'm going to call it handle submit Pokemon. Or actually, I'll just call it handle Pokemon form, since this is for the form, and we might have a different method for actually making the API call. And I need to create that method in a moment, which is why I'm getting the error. So I'll come back to that. And then, I apologize. I always get confused with HTML forms. We may actually want this to be not a button, but since we're using a HTML form, I'll often just use like divs and fields. We may want this to be an input of type submit. With a placeholder. I'll just call this like update Pokemon. And we can worry about like if we want to have, say, a button to hide or show the form. We can come back to that one later. That's actually, I think, a great feature to have, but not one I'm gonna worry too much about right now. I just want to kind of get things rolling. So now I've got a submit button. Because I haven't written any logic, what you can see happening here is HTML forms, right? This form element that we've now added. This is like these were basically created along with browsers. They're so baked into browsers that there's a default behavior. And if I look at this in the network tab, I can actually see this happening. Whenever I hit submit, the browser does the work of sending a post request for me, which is not necessarily what we want. And again, I'm not exactly sure why in the moment in the network tab, there we go. Let's see which one is our post request here. Oh, we're not even seeing the post request because when the browser submits, the server probably 404s or something, and we get a page refresh. And this behavior is so old and baked in because you had to submit a form and then you would have to refresh the page to fetch new data from the server or get redirected. And we really don't want any of that at all to happen. There are advantages to using the HTML form element. There's some accessibility related stuff and some other things that are useful. But what we do want to do is in our form element here for on submit, I'm going to pass in and I'm going to write a handle submit Pokemon form function, which is a really long name, but it's at least explicit. And it's going to look something like this. It's going to take in an event, a DOM event, which the browser does the work of creating for us. And the first thing I want to do is not do anything with that event at all. I don't want the browser's default behavior of sending this post request and fetching the page with, like, you know, if we had a server with just a bunch of files and it was 1992 and we didn't have a single page app, that would all be good. But none of that is what we want. And so there is this method on DOM events, which are JavaScript objects, prevent default, that stops any of that from happening. And I'll just do a console log here. We'll just say form submit. And fingers crossed, when I click on the button, none of that refresh stuff should be happening. And now I should just get a console log message. So this is a good start, right? We haven't hooked it up yet. We haven't made the Axios request. We're not using React State. We have to get the data from the form fields, but we've got our UI up and running, and we've cleared the field of the undesired browser behavior. So let me just pause and check in and see what questions people have. Okay, cool. Let's get this rolling. So now we want to get our data from the request, right? That's really our next step here. And there's a couple different ways to do that. There is a way to grab it kind of from the whole form. However, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best approach. Just as a quick kind of like view into this world. So whenever a form is submitted, and everyone should see like a browser, the Mozilla developer docs in like a giant font right now, correct? Awesome. Yeah, so this submit DOM event fires whenever a form is submitted. And the thing to know with React is we really want React to do the work. There's a lot of DOM stuff that we want to avoid. There's ways to get all the fields from here. It honestly gets like a little messy, and I'm not even sure if we want to do it. There's this stuff with form data. There's ways to do it, but it's almost as much work as whatever benefit is that we get. And you can see there's these weird query selectors that we kind of start to write and stuff, and we kind of hit a point of diminishing returns. So in a lot of ways, what's easier is to bypass the form and create React component state for each of these fields, which feels a little bit like extra work, but actually gives us a really simple, understandable, repeatable pattern. And if we really needed to, if we had like 50 fields, we could write a function to auto-generate stuff for us. So what I want to do is let's hook each of these input fields up to some React component state. So we have the Pokemon name and the description and captured. So let's go ahead and create some state for this stuff. And since this is all the new values that we're gonna want to put in, I'm gonna call these form fields like new type, new description, and so on. So it's gonna look something like this. Actually, let's just start with name. And we'll put in an empty string just as a hint to other programmers that this should contain a string. And now let me go ahead and update this, my form field for name, to use this bit of state. And And again, I'm choosing name right now because it's an easy one to see, but we may not want the user to be able to update the Pokemon's name at all. But the nice thing about it is, like, for testing and development purposes, it's really easy to see what happens. So every input field has an onChange attribute. And again, this is coming from HTML that React lets us hook into. And we can write a little arrow function here. And every onChange event for a form field fires off an event. This actually happens every time you type. It fires off this little event. And we can tell with some JavaScript, our JavaScript program in React, what to do. And what I want to do is set new name, event, and then the syntax for getting the actual value, the thing that we care about, is event.target.value. And if we added a console log here, we could actually see this print out like every time we type, but that's okay. We don't have to do that right now. And let me do a quick page refresh, because I did see a little funniness in the console, and it does look like there's something complaining. So let's see, React DOM warning, checked field, blah, 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 blah. Okay, it's just a warning. I'm going to ignore it. So that seems to be working, right? And if I want to test to confirm that this is working, what I'll do actually is I'll use React DevTools, and I'll use their select to click on right here. This component. So I'm going to have to dig down a little bit to find the Pokemon form. But notice over here, this is the really cool thing, I think, about React DevTools, because it is kind of a pain to see the prop tree structure with all the React router stuff. But I can select a component and I can see its props and its state. So in fact, as I type, it takes a minute for React DevTools to update, but you can see every time I type, this bit of state is being updated. I'm not sure why they don't tell us the name there, but we can see that that's for the name. So that's a great sign. Right now, I haven't had to write a unit test, but I did a little ad hoc test to make sure this is working. And now for description, we can follow the same pattern. And now over here, again, I'm just going to copy and paste. And again, there's sort of the rule of three. If I start repeating myself more than 3 times, then maybe I'm going to write a function or something to abstract it out to help me, or a component. But if it's just 1 or 2 or 3, honestly, it's not really worth it. And sometimes even if it's more, it's not worth it. There's something to be said for having our code be explicit, readable, and simple to see what's going on, and easy to change either of these without it messing with the other. And now over here, I'm not sure why that says effect, but there should be a bit more state. And if I change it, we should see stuff happens if I click on Pokemon form and if I give it a minute. And indeed, this one's working as well, which is awesome. So again, I'm not writing unit tests, but I can actually test as I go. And that's incredibly helpful, because if I have a bug, it's going to be tiny and easier to catch. And now let's hook up our checkbox. And again, we're just going to kind of follow our same pattern here. And we're going to do captured and set captured. And our default state is going to be a little different here, because unlike these text input fields that have a placeholder, the checkbox has this checked property, and that determines what shows up here. And we want React to drive that bus. And there's actually kind of a term for this, like controlled component, where it really, React is controlling the data and what shows up there. And we don't want to have, the browser be really tracking that stuff. So what I can do is our default state here should in fact be Pokemon dot captured. And our Pokemon, I don't think is captured, so that is going to be unchecked. And that'll be a great little test to do once we get this working to confirm that our update logic is good. And we have just a little bit more work to do here on the checkbox, and then we'll be ready to move on. And that little bit of work actually, and so this is the good part, and this is why this is called a controlled component. On change, we have an event, and I don't need the parentheses if it's just one argument and like a one-line arrow function. Set captured, so I'll add the parentheses for consistency. And it's not event target value because this is a checkbox type and we want to flip this checked attribute. There are other ways to do this, right? We could actually just sort of do the opposite of whatever the Boolean value is. And in fact, that may be what I need to do. Let's see if I have a console error. Oh, so this is working. Yeah, let's try this, because what I really want to have happen is I want to change it to, I think, maybe the opposite of whatever its current state is. Let's see if that one works. No, the checkboxes, it always does get a little trickier here. I've got set captured. I've got oh, of course. I'm so sorry. Let me run back in time here a bit. So I have a mistake on line 41 here. Can anyone spot what I need to change that will hopefully make this checkbox work? Why is it that even though I have this on change event, I click on it, but the value of the checkbox doesn't change?
Do you need to set it to the opposite of captured?
Close, very close. Right now, it's set to the value of our Pokemon prop captured, right? But is Pokemon captured ever going to change its value right now?
No.
Right. Because I pass in this Pokemon object as a prop, and that's what we get, and that's the value of the prop, right? And that's not going to change unless a new prop is passed in. What is going to change its value and that we might want to set checked to instead?
Captured.
Yeah, our React component state captured. And the naming here was kind of confusing. And so Cody, I apologize if you were going down this path as well. But so this is where let's set captured to whatever the value is from our props of the Pokemon. Let's set that to the default value of the checkbox. And then, so we need to have our input be connected to our React component state. And now this should work. And as a sanity check, I am going to look in React DevTools at the components, just to confirm that that little bit of captured state over here is changing as desired. If I do a page refresh, it should be false because I don't think our Pokemon was caught. Now that state is changing, right? So Pokemon.captured is not changing. That's the prop, but our bit of state is. Does that make sense? And do folks have any questions? Cool, awesome. We've got our component state, we've got it hooked up to the form. And then the next natural step here is let's make our Ajax request, right? So we're gonna need to do a couple things. We're gonna need to make an Axios call. And we might need a use effect to handle it properly. But we can at least write out the Axios call and get started and grab our data and send it over there, right? And go from there. And what I might actually do here, in fact, is I might, let's see where we want to do this, because we have the Pokemon item up here, right? And we have this get icon async function here, and we have this use effect here. And then that gets passed in, and all the Pokemon stuff gets passed in here. So some of this stuff we may want to use elsewhere. We can kind of see as we go. We might end up wanting to put our update Pokemon logic here, because I've got my form with my data, but when my Pokemon changes, like if we change the Pokemon type, that does start to get a little more complex, because these things start to change as well, right? And this gets a little more complicated to make sure that this stuff is rendered correctly, because this stuff is passed in as a prop. And so right now I could do all the updating I want here, but if the prop that's passed into here doesn't change, then we won't see these things update. So I just want to kind of call that out as a potential issue. And the solution may be all this stuff becomes its own component, so we can pass Pokemon in as a prop. But up here at this higher level, maybe we have Pokemon as state or something. Or to be honest, what we can also do is just trigger a whole page refresh of the whole thing so that the whole app reloads. And that might actually be a bit of an easier way to get started, especially because you just want to see this flow kind of working. And I do realize we've been running for a bit, so I just kind of want to pause and check in with folks, because I know we like people, it's good to have work time for assignments. So kind of before we do this next step, and to just kind of to preview what we're going to do here. We're going to do one, right? Like update Pokemon Axios call wrapped in a use effect, like normal. And then as a part of that, we will have to update all the state for the Pokemon form. And then two, let's just force a page refresh, so the whole React app reloads, which means it will get the newly updated Pokemon data from the database. And not now, but like as a stretch goal, 3, move all Pokemon rendering stuff into child components so we can pass Pokemon down as props and store updated Pokemon from update Pokemon as React component state at the parent level in this component. Right, and this one we probably won't get to this morning, but this gets us where we need to go. Before we dive into that, let me go ahead and just show you all what we have lined up for the assignment for today. So the big one and the one I think to get started on, and that I may. Oh, am I looking at the right spot here? I apologize. Give me 1 sec, folks. Let me make sure I'm looking at the right spot. Oh, we totally are. I always get thrown every time I read this description. I always get a little thrown. I'm like, oh, that's what we're doing today. And I just have to remember that's the whole project. So here we're going to add updating student data, right? For grades and for the students. So we're going to want to create this CRUD capability for these models. Really, again, the focus is on getting the Django working first. The React is important for today as well, but that's really the main assignment for the day. There is also a to-do list, which is more practice with this, which is quite good, like to get all of these working. So those are kind of the things that we have lined up to add this stuff to the school assignment. And then let's build a new app, a to-do app, which is like the classic kind of React learning app and a lot of full stack apps. Because a to-do list is a great way to practice CRUD and create, read, update, delete. So I know I've been rolling for a bit and that, having work time in the morning is important. So let's actually check in about that, and maybe people who want to work on stuff can go ahead and do that. So I've got my form. I've got everything hooked up. I click the submit button. And, at least I'm printing something out from my React code. But our natural next step here is we want to actually send a request to React, right? And so I've been pretty good on my to-do list. I've created my UI elements and I have a good pattern I can follow. Some sort of handler function to grab the data from those fields. That actually would be a good next step, right? Because I'm going to want to update Pokemon and do all this stuff in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this. I'm going to scroll down to our other component where we've got this get icon method, and I'm going to use this as my guide code. And I'm going to do, I'm going to call it const update Pokemon. And it's going to be an async method. And we're going to put all our stuff in there in just a minute. But we know we're going to need a use effect for anything that's doing asynchronous stuff, like an AJAX HTTP request, right? Like AJAX is short for asynchronous JavaScript, by the way. So that's why I kind of use it interchangeably, which is a fancy way of saying an HTTP request. And we're going to use AJAX to make a put request. So we're going to call update Pokemon, right? And just for the moment, I'm going to do it like this. I need my double brackets, so this works. So I need to make this real with Axios, etc., and so on, right? And so my steps are: 1, get the data. 2, make the Axios call. 3, handle success. And 4, handle error. So I'd love a little help with this process. How can I get the data? Let's start there. Where is the data that I want living right now?
The database.
Close. We get the data from the database that populates this Pokemon form and Pokemon item stuff to begin with. I want to send our Django server the new updated Pokemon information, right? And where's that information living right now in our React app in the front end?
In your different use states.
Yeah, exactly. We've gone ahead and we've hooked up these form fields, and now when I type stuff into them, and you all might not be able to see, but I'm like, I've got my hands here pretending to type. The React component state gets updated. And that's the updated Pokemon data that we want to send back. So we want to do something like this. Const, let's just call this new Pokemon data because I like to be really verbose. Or I'll just call it data. I know that certain things I'm not quite in sync with the code in the lesson. So I try to stay generally in line so that it's easy for people to reference one or the other, like when reviewing the video. And this has to match the shape of our model, right? If I jump all the way back to our Pokemon model, we've got all these things: name, level, date encountered, date captured, description. And if we look at, our Thunder client request, unfortunately, I'm not sure. I think there's a way to see the history. If I look in here, it's from 6 days ago. Yeah, I don't know if there's a good way to see. There probably is a way to see the history that I don't know. I probably need to watch the video too. But if you all remember, basically in the body of this request here, we put a bunch of JSON, like name, who. And these have to match up with the model names that Django is expecting and have the data in the right format. And that's what we're going to do here as well. And it's relatively straightforward because we've got name, new name, and description, new description, and captured. Well, it's just captured. And actually, there's a nice shorthand in JavaScript where if a variable is named the same thing you want to name the property on an object, I can just do this. So this is the data that we want to send, right? This is get the updated Pokemon data. We're going to send to our API. Step 2 is let's make the Axios call. And this is going to look pretty common to what we've done in the past. We need an await because this is the asynchronous behavior here is making this HTTP request. And the good news is, well, in the past, we've done get HTTP 127.0.0.1 8000 API v1 Pokemon / let's put in our Pokemon ID. Just like API view is really Django REST framework, and its API view is designed to help us build REST APIs. all of this stuff is such a common architecture pattern that Axios is too. And doing this will send an HTTP request where the verb is put instead of get. And what we can always do with any HTTP request is pass Axios a second argument for the request body. And because JavaScript objects turn into JSON so nicely, since that's how JSON was built, right? JSON is short for JavaScript object notation. We can just pass this in, and this becomes our request body. And if I hover over here and look at the put method, it's kind of hard to read because this is a sort of more formal, verbose way of describing arguments. But this is the bit that we care about, where the first argument is the URL that's we're sending the HTTP request to, and that's part of the request. And the second argument is this optional object name data. There's other stuff that we can do with Axios as well, but that's all that we need to worry about at the moment. I do need to add a catch to handle errors. And I'm just going to console log the error if it happens. And now I've got my response data. And so that's handling my error right there. And now let's handle success. And for the moment, let's just console log success, right? With response.data and just see what we get back, right? We've written a lot of code here. Let's make sure that this works. So I've got an awfully far here. All right, I've written my update Pokemon wrapped in a use effect. We're going to have to deal with this bit of updating state for the whole Pokemon form. So I'll just kind of get rid of that stuff. So if I go back to my Pokemon item code and I look at what we wrote before with get icon in the use effect, we wanted this asynchronous function, this use effect to fire off right when the component, after it mounted, right? And after every time that it renders. When do we want this update Pokemon method in this use effect to fire off? Do we want it to fire off right when I render the component or at a different time? Right, I've typed this stuff in. When do I want to make that HTTP call to Django with the put request with the data that we want to update and save to the database for our Pokemon?
On submit.
Yeah, exactly, on submit. And I apologize. I know sometimes some of the questions I ask are, there's this delicate balance between a good kind of question to get to the next step and something that's just almost a little bit too much of a leading question or straightforward. So I click submit and I want that to happen. And I don't have that set up yet, right? I have handle submit Pokemon form. But I'm not calling my update Pokemon method. So there's a couple options for how to do this actually. This isn't really doing anything at all right now. So in fact, I could just maybe, I kind of by default, I write separate functions for form handling because sometimes there's an intermediate step, but we don't really need this, right? We could just move this into update Pokemon and make that call. The question then becomes, once the Pokemon gets updated, how do we put the new stuff in our form fields, right? Because right now, when this loads, I've got the Pokemon name in the placeholder and the Pokemon description, and if it's caught or not. And it'd be nice if I hit submit if that updated. We have to get this stuff to update too, but that's a different challenge. And there's two ways to tackle this. Let me show you the first way, and then actually I think we will have time for the second way. So the first way is honestly pretty straightforward, which is force a page refresh. So the whole React app reloads and we re-render this whole Pokemon page, which means calling the database, which means getting the new version of our stuff. So if I'm doing this, I don't need, honestly, all I'll do here, I'm just going to call this update Pokemon method or function that we wrote. And I don't need this use effect at all. And what I am going to do as a part of my success is I do want to look at my success response messages. So let's actually we should console log this data here. The great thing about Axios and this catch error is that I believe it does look at the HTTP response codes, and if there's an error response code, that's what causes this catch to get called. Well, let's just be explicit and look for exactly what we're looking for, which is response.status is 204, which is what we told our API to send back. And we're going to do window location reload, which is going to refresh the whole page.
Here's
Now-
an error.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Sean pointed it out in the chat, but there's an extra slash in the protocol. when we're
Oh,
looking
yeah,
at-
it totally is. Yeah, thank you, Sean and Clarice. That's a good catch. Let's run this and see if it's easy or hard to use the console message to spot it. But I'm really glad you guys caught it, because that's going to save us a little time. Let's change the name to Pikachu and give it a description of, I don't know, first Pokemon, and Pikachu is now caught. Let's see what happens. So, interestingly, it submits. It actually worked, which I totally admit to being surprised by. Maybe that is some weird quirk of like what makes or doesn't make a valid URL. Because if we get rid of this semicolon, we should definitely run into trouble, unless I'm totally losing my mind. Yeah, that it does not like at all. So I did not know that, but apparently 3 forward slashes is okay, though I do not recommend it. But we can go ahead and, interestingly, now I get a 400 bad request. Oh, so we don't, this is where sending data back is really helpful, because the problem here is my Pokemon name needs to start with a capital letter. And so this is where you get to make other programmers really happy when you design your APIs to return error messages with good information. And that does indeed work. And we see this put request. And if I in fact go into Django console and do Pokemon objects all, I see that it's been updated. So let me pause and check in and see what questions people have. And then I think maybe I'll show another approach for doing some of this front end stuff. Are people feeling pretty good about this front end code? Or like you want to kind of get your hands on it and build it? Or maybe somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think just repetition and hands-on.
Cool. I think that totally makes sense. At the same time, if there is a piece of this that is useful to walk through, I do think there's value to doing that now. I kind of understand some hesitation, especially because I know we do want to break for lunch. But if there's something that someone's curious about that we can like clarify in 60 seconds, that's going to save you like 30 minutes. I'd much rather, just do that now.
Well, I'm wondering if the delete is simple.
The delete is simple. The backend logic for the delete is simpler. On the front end side, the slightly tricky bit with both approaches is, well, the delete, especially if we do window location reload, the delete is simple because this refreshes and now that Pokemon is gone. So it's not going to render at all when we refetch all of the Pokemon and rebuild everything. So this approach is actually makes both creation and delete really simple because we refresh page to force our React app to hit get API v1 Pokemon for the updated info on all Pokemon from our database. Yeah, so create and delete end up being pretty straightforward. What I think I'll just briefly show it because it's a little more complex, and I hear that people kind of want to dig into this a bit. But another way to handle this would be this Pokemon item is our parent component, right? And Pokemon gets passed in as a prop. And then all this stuff gets rendered here. Well, what if we did something like actually, what's probably easier is just to demo breaking it out into components. What if we did something like, let's just move this stuff into the Pokemon form. We could move this stuff in there as well if we wanted. That one, I think maybe I don't want to demo right now because I think that will be, there's a couple extra steps, but in essence, what you would do is like, we would have get icon and all this stuff up here. And we would also have all that other update Pokemon stuff. And we can pass these functions in as props. Or alternatively, instead of like Pokemon.name for all of this stuff, we do something like const current Pokemon set current Pokemon equals use state, and its default value is Pokemon. So we use this Pokemon prop to populate this state right away. And then in here, if I do like current Pokemon name, current Pokemon level, like current Pokemon moves, da 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 da. Now, all of a sudden, if I kind of take this update Pokemon function and drop it in, right? What I can do in my success is instead of window location reload, I can do set current Pokemon response. Really, we'd have to set it to data. It gets a little more complex. We'd probably actually want to modify the backend to send back the updated Pokemon object. That's usually what you see with this pattern. So I apologize. That was a little bit more of a rabbit hole than I realized. I didn't mean to go quite far down that road. But there's a couple ways to play with this. The benefit of this current approach with window location refresh is it's effective and it's straightforward, and it will work great with create, update, reading and deleting. And is there anything else that folks may be curious about that we should touch on before we wrap for lunch?
Adam, I was just curious if you could just take like a couple minutes to walk through just the flow of all this real quick.
Yeah, totally. That's a great call. Let's walk through this with our client code. And let's do this from the top, and let's go to the home page. So I'm on my home page. And in fact, over here, let's open up the Django terminal. So I put localhost 5173 in the browser. And where's my Django terminal hiding? Let me kill and restart it because I want to see. Yeah, and let me do a hard refresh. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is talking to React v dev server. That's why we're not seeing anything here yet. I apologize. So first off, I load this in the browser. It doesn't talk to Django. It talks to v dev server that sends it an index.html file and all the JavaScript for a React app. Right, and all this stuff has happened. I'm not sure what that rock request is. I'll just kind of get rid of that. And in fact, if I click on all, I do a hard refresh again, we can see it. And this is the browser saying, hey, beat dev server, send me index.html. And then it hits like a script tag and it's like, cool, beat dev server, send me all of these little JavaScript files and CSS files and everything I need to get the JavaScript and CSS that I need. And it's all that's kind of in that index.html there. And we haven't even talked to Django yet. Now, I click on Pokemon. We have talked to Django. And we can see that our React app just sent a GET request to our Django server, right? To our API that we wrote, saying, hey, give me all the Pokemon, right? And the reason that it does that is because if we go to pages, Pokemon, we have this get all Pokemon async request wrapped in this use effect hook so that once we go here and React router does its thing and the Pokemon page has mounted and rendered, use effect fires off this get all Pokemon function. We make this Axios request to get the whole list of Pokemon. Django does its thing and sends it back. And do people want me to walk through what's going on the Django side or just kind of focus on at this level of walking through the flow? I'll just kind of keep going on at this level. And if you want me to go deeper, just let me know. So now we've got our Pokemon data. We've navigated in React router, which is entirely on the front end in the browser here, to our Pokemon page. And we use this map to render all these Pokemon items. Right? And this Pokemon item component, every time one of these components gets mounted and rendered, it makes an Axios call too. to the noun project, or I'm sorry, to our Django API, which then talks to the noun project. And we don't see Django talking to the noun project here in the Django console. Though we could add a print statement to see that, which would actually be very cool and useful. But we can see here, hey, I'm making a GET request to API/v1/noun/rock. And that's kind of what we hooked up yesterday, where Django then takes that and talks to the noun project and makes its own API request, gets that back, sends that back to our React app. And then here we, then once we have the icon, we render it. And we have this ternary here so that we don't try and show an image asset when we haven't gotten back the URL for the image icon to begin with. And you can see that once we have that image URL for the icon, the browser actually makes another HTTP request to go get it, which is how browsers get images, right? From anywhere. Once you have that image URL, the browser makes a GET request to wherever that URL points to grab the asset, the resource, right? So at this point, we're over here. And what I added and what we added today to our front end code is this Pokemon item component. I stuck in this Pokemon form component at the end, right? I stuck it inside there. We could have had it all. We could have just made the Pokemon. We didn't have to make it a separate component. For me, it's a little easier to keep things organized that way and think about that. But you could have coded this all in there directly if you wanted. I even put this in the same file. And so then this component renders, right? Because React components, it's like a tree. You pass the props into the parent. It does whatever it does in the parent component with state and use effect and Axios. And then when we hit that return statement, it starts rendering stuff. And if there's another component in there, that's a child in the component tree, and it renders that too, right? And that's how it's building up these HTML elements that then like form our DOM tree. And so now we've got this Pokemon form, but nothing has happened here yet, right? I wrote this async function, but unlike the other one, there's no use effect. So there's nothing like causing this to automatically fire. What we've done now is, if I go to components, and let's go ahead and look at our, if I go all the way down inside Pokemon item, all the way down to Pokemon form, right? We've passed in this Pokemon object that we got from the database from that all Pokemon API call. And we're using it as placeholders. And I'll just get rid of these comments, in fact, because these are just getting in the way at this point. Right, in my input field, placeholder, Pokemon.name, Pokemon.description. And the checkbox is not from the prop, it's from state, because we do want to see what happens immediately when we click that checkbox. And I have all this component state that I created for each of these input fields. So when I add stuff in here, the state for this Pokemon form React component changes, right? Because that's how React component state works and how it's designed to do. And this is one of the really nice things about how we can use it with form fields. What's going to happen when I click this submit button is, like the way all this stuff works in the browser is every time you move the mouse or type or do anything, it fires off a DOM event. And so that's like what React is grabbing to update this stuff, right? That's what happens with these on change attributes here. And so the big one being on submit. And this is kind of baked into HTML. If you stick like an input field of type submit in a form, and we could have done this with a button and hooked it up the other way, this is gonna fire off an on submit event that this form element captures, and it's going to call this handle submit form function. This is really just a wrapper. We didn't need this. The only important bit here is prevent default to prevent the browser from trying to send a post request with the form data in this like archaic format to God knows where, to wherever we don't want it to go. Because instead we want to use our JavaScript logic to make that Axios call. And that's what's happening here in, excuse me, in update Pokemon. So now when I click submit, let's go to the network and let's clear this out. It did work. I'm not sure what fired off that other 400. That's something to explore for another day. We fire off. I didn't really talk about the HTTP options request that gets sent. Basically, like there's actually a little bit of a pre-check that happens before like a put or a post or a delete, where like this options request is sent, and so there's an HTTP request where the verb is options, and you can see that here. And Django handles that automatically, and that's sort of a baked in HTTP behavior to check for certain things like authentication, and maybe cores and stuff like that. So we can ignore that. And then I did run into a problem, and I'm not sure what my problem was. And maybe the error will detail us. Ensure this value has at least 7 characters. In the Django terminal, it has 5. So that's actually a validation error. Because I clicked Fiery and it went to submit, and it went to our API view, right, for the Pokemon app. And really, I won't, there's a bit too much, I think, to go in there. But again, just remember the serializer, the validator, the model all hook up together. So all that model validation we did, Django just said, hey, that's great that you want me to use the serializer to change this Pokemon's name to Charmander and give him a fiery description. But actually, the description needs to have at least 7 characters. So I'm going to send back an error 404. Or whatever error message code 400 that we sent back. So let's try this again. And let me clear this as well. And now that worked successfully, right? And I see that if I look in the network tab, I didn't clear this one as well. But it's probably right up here. So I think it's oldest to newest. Here's our 204 response. I'll change Charmander again, actually, so we can see this happen again and see it in the network tab in the browser. And we'll make Charmander be caught. This field may not be blank. Not quite sure what field. Oh, because I didn't type anything in Charmander because the placeholder was there. So this is where writing user interfaces actually gets a little tricky because there's all these little edge cases and things to consider. We do this one more time. So the other thing that happens here is a whole page refresh, which is part of why we're not seeing the individual request here in the network tab. But that Axios put request with Charmander's new data gets sent to Django, and we can see our print statement here. And I highly recommend just littering your code with print statements to help you walk through the flow like this. I think it helps a ton. I really like putting the name of like the method or function or where it's coming from up front and having a consistent format so I can like read them really easily. Django sends back a success response. And then the key is in this update Pokemon function in our React component in this Pokemon form, window location reload. And remember, that's like a browser API thing where I'm going to force a refresh of the whole page. And that's our quick and dirty way of forcing the React app to reload and refetch all the Pokemon from the database, which is what gets us the new updated Pokemon data. It does feel like a lot of steps. We can maybe diagram it out a bit later, but this is where I think, again, I'm just going to use an image just as an example here, not as anything real. So this one is tiny and terrible, so I won't use that one. Maybe this is good. This is exactly what I want. Making diagrams like this helps a lot. Like, you've got your browser and your server, you can draw some arrows with the HTTP requests, responses, what data is heading in which direction. You can add what happens on each side for each step. And honestly, that is really how I kind of taught and learned these things. And I think it's an important part of this process. But hopefully that helped. I know I ran a bit long there, so we definitely should wrap for lunch. But hopefully that helped to walk through the flow like that. And I would encourage you guys to practice doing that too. Like, once you've finished the assignments for today, take some time adding some print statements to sort of walk through the flow, or, you know, we can do it in the code demo at the end of the day and stuff. So hopefully, was that helpful? Somewhat, or it still kind of feels like a lot of stuff?
I mean, it's still a lot, but it's helpful to kind of slowly piece together and just kind of keep hearing it.
Yeah, for sure. And I may be going into too much detail in some places. It's not always easy for me to know like what's the right level to go into. I kind of always err on the side of precision, for better or worse. And sometimes it's a little too much information, I think. But walking through the flow like that is kind of exactly what you want to do. Let me go ahead and